Yeah, excited that we can all connect around this really interesting topic. I wanted to start by asking you a little question. So, could you please send a reaction? You see that you can send reactions at the in the bottom if you're not Swiss, or if your parents or grandparents are not Swiss. Okay, great. And could you please also send a reaction if someone close to you, like a partner, relative, or a close friend, does not have a Swiss nationality? Okay, so it's fair to say that most of us, if not all of us, have a very personal relationship to migration, right? So I think it's really important to remember that migration affects all of us in a personal way. It happens all around us, and it's not just about people that we see on TV or that we read about in the media. It's actually the people around us, the people that we love. And people move for all sorts of reasons. So we might focus a little bit more on people who move because of conflict, for political reasons, but people also move for lack of economic opportunity. People move for love. People move because they crave adventure, because of personal preferences, or because of for family reasons. And so there's lots of reasons why uh, someone would decide to cross borders. And actually, statistics show, interestingly, that over time, people crossing borders as a percentage of the total population has stayed pretty stable. So if we move to the next slide, and if not stable, at least it's been rising really quite slowly. So it goes back to what Christina was saying, that the myth around the fact that there's a migration crisis and all of a sudden like everyone's moving all around doesn't really show in the numbers. And people have been moving for as long as research can show us, and people will continue to move, especially as we live in a globalized economy. So maybe the focus that we should be having is not how do we stop people from moving, but how do we adapt the nation state to the realities of migration. So maybe that's something that we could discuss in one of the other sessions, if that's of interest. And that could help us also to de-dramatize migration and the whole discourse around it. But the topics that I'd like to focus on more today are twofold. So firstly, the link between migration and racism. And secondly, the impact of migration on the Swiss economy. So if we go to the next slide, when we start to think about migration, I think, especially in the public discourse and also in Switzerland, we need to start thinking about racism. So a simple definition of racism could be that racism is a social construct. It's about taking people who have an attribute in common and then starting to depict them as a homogeneous group. It's very simple, so sorry for making it so simple, but it's about attributing a whole set of fixed characteristics to this group of people and erasing the human differences and the individualities within this group. So when we think about migration in this way, we can start to see how migrants have been racialized in the public discourse. How often do people make a link between skin color, and then go on to religion, to nationality, and to the term foreigner, and all of this becomes confluted, and you start to realize how people can be racialized and start from there to suffer from discrimination. And so you're going to tell me, well, it can't be about racism in Europe because nobody's talking about racism. I don't read about migrants suffering from racism necessarily, because the problem is about culture, right? Like the argument is that there's too much cultural difference, and so we can't have migrants coming to Switzerland because the culture is just too different. But what if we took a step back and started to think, are we just using the word culture as a conceptual replacement for the word race? Because we feel so uncomfortable about talking about racism in Europe that we just talk about culture and we say, well, these people, they have one culture. So we imagine like one block of culture coming to Switzerland that doesn't fit with our own block of culture. But actually, that's not really what it is, because people who come to Switzerland are individuals who are all different and have their own individualities and are very heterogeneous, just like us in Switzerland are all very different, and we don't necessarily have one set culture that stays the same over time. Um, And I think it's important when we read about migration and we think about the discourse around migration to also think about history and to think about colonial the colonial past in Switzerland. So once again, you're going to tell me I'm out of my mind. Switzerland doesn't have colonies. It didn't have colonies. And that's true. It didn't have formal colonies in the sense that we understand, the UK or France to have had colonies. But Switzerland was involved in the colonial project, and they developed a colonial imaginary of their own through this involvement. So if we go to the next slide, we can think of a famous shop that we probably all know here in Zurich. Switzerland benefited from colonial trade, colonial goods. They participated in colonial scientific research. They were sending missionaries to colonized lands, as well as military forces. And so that's how Switzerland started to develop its own colonial imaginary. And if we want to come to terms with this fear of migration that we have, this fear that the brown and the black people are going to come and, are going to start to take things away from us and from our country and from the way we live, maybe we need to think and to recognize the legacies of colonialism in Europe, and especially in Switzerland more specifically. And this way we can start to see migration as, people moving across borders, people we love, that we know, and who have decided for one reason or another to cross a border, and not just, foreigners who are coming and who are really dangerous and scary. So maybe a little exercise that we could do in the breakout session afterwards is also to think about, how do we use the word expat and how do we use the word migrant? That's maybe something that we want to discuss a little bit more afterwards, because I think that's also closely linked to race, actually. And now I'd like to spend the last few minutes that I have to speak about the link between migration and the economy. So that's something that Christina already touched upon in her talk. And we come to the 25%. So about 25% of the Swiss population is made of foreigners, which, to be honest, is also a reflection of the very strict naturalization policies in Switzerland. So we need to always keep that in mind when we see that number. And it's also, if we go to the next slide, it's also interesting to see that about a third of the personnel in hospitals, in Spitex, and in care homes are migrants. So when we start to think about these numbers, we realize how migrants are so important to our economy, but also to taking care of ourselves and the people around us, right? And so, as Christina was saying, research shows that migrants consume, they open businesses, they boost innovation, they tend to work harder and are more efficient. And they, well, when they can, pay taxes, but use very little social services. So these are all aspects through which migrants can and do contribute to the economy. I think it's pretty much a consensus that high-scale migration is beneficial, at least to the country where migrants go to. But there's more controversy around low-scale migration. And there's controversial research showing that low-scale migration can potentially have an impact on low-skilled workers in the country where they arrive. So again, it's debatable, but there's research that's shown that migrants tend to be ready to work for cheaper, for longer hours, in worse conditions. And even if they don't necessarily always compete for the same jobs, having more low-scale migration can, in certain circumstances, lead to higher unemployment for natives and to lower wages. However, researchers have found it hard, and this is really something that comes across when you're reading academic literature. Researchers are finding it hard to measure exactly the gains and the losses of migration, because actually we say migration in the singular. We should really be talking about migrations. But anyways, that's maybe another topic. And maybe then, if it's so hard to find the answer to that question, why don't we move away from it? Why, if we stop thinking, is migration beneficial or not? Because we've established that it's happening anyways. So maybe the question that we should really be thinking about is, how can we ensure that everyone, whether you're a native or a migrant, can meet their basic needs in the system in which we live? So regardless of migration, we know that there are some groups that tend to systematically lose out from economic globalization and technological advancements, right? So maybe the real focus should be on adopting the type of policies and the structures that are needed to protect the most economically vulnerable people in our societies. And maybe that's something that we can touch upon a bit more in the breakout sessions afterwards. I just maybe, if I can take 10 more seconds of your time. I also wanted to quickly touch upon the fact that I've seen an amazing film the other day that was made by a man called Roba Mossa. And he made it's an amazing short film about one of the detention facilities of asylum seekers in Kloten near Zurich. I can't share the link with you tonight, and we couldn't share the movie tonight because he's actually applying to show it at the Zurich Film Festival. But I'll make sure if it does get published to share it with Lara and Rachel, and then maybe they can spread it around so that anyone who's interested can also see the short film.
Thanks a lot, Marie, for also